Hi everybody. I'm going to get started with lecture. So this is the start of chapter 1 in your textbook. So if you have questions, start by looking through the chapter and hopefully that'll help answer some of your questions. And then otherwise, you can let me know on Moodle or through email. So the first topic is, of course, what is conservation biology? This class basically goes over an introduction to conservation biology that includes conserving resources, but also conserving species and ecosystems. So, conservation biology is an integrated multidisciplinary scientific field that has been developed in response to the challenge of preserving species and ecosystems. So you can see here that the main definition is more concerned with the environment than conserving resources for people, but both are included within this general field. There are three primary goals of conservation. One is to document biodiversity, which is basically a word that's shortened to combine biological diversity, biodiversity. To investigate the impacts that we people have on species, genetic variation, and ecosystems, and develop different approaches to help maintain biodiversity, basically. So to maintain the diversity of species, maintain the diversity of genes, and to restore ecosystems and their functions. And the ecosystem function part is a lot to do with how ecosystems help society and help people. So things like mitigating floods, protecting us from hurricanes, pollination of our crops, all of these really important things that we get from having diverse species on our planet. So why do we need conservation biology? And I'm going to pause here for a second because I'd like you to get out a piece of paper and write down some things that you think are why we need conservation biology. And if you have a lot of things you want to write down to get started, you can even pause the video. So hopefully you came up with a few different reasons. And a lot of times when I ask this to the class, I get things like logging or deforestation or overhunting, pollution, climate change. I get things like that. But those are all really important threats to species and ecosystems and genetic diversity. But there are two things that underlie all of those problems, and they have to do with people. And so one is that people use natural resources. And we need conservation to make sure we keep having resources. There are all these things that ecosystems do for us that we need, and if the ecosystems are not functioning properly, then it just won't work. The second one is human population growth. So it's the amount of resources the average person needs multiplied by the total number of people. Now, obviously, people in different parts of the world use different amounts of resources, and different areas are growing more than others. But on a global scale, this is generally why we need conservation biology, and it's why ecosystems are being degraded, why species are disappearing in a lot of cases. So how many people are there on Earth today? So I'll give you a second to think about that. And then there's this really cool website that we can pull up that will estimate how many people are on the planet today. And you can see we've made it to 7.8 billion people. And this also shows us how many people were born today. And this is an estimate. They're not actually counting every person that's being born and died. But they have the overall rates, and so they can project it into the future. And these are updated every time there's new data. So that's interesting. Here's my little cartoon. And so the population of people has been growing pretty rapidly over the last few hundred years. But over time, the total number of people did not change dramatically until relatively recently. And so you can see that we had less than 1 billion people from the dawn of humanity through some of our most well-known ancient civilizations, ancient Egyptians, ancient Romans, all the way through the kind of Middle Ages until the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is where we see the line start to curve. And this is what we call an exponential growth curve. And so it starts increasing really rapidly at some point. And so we've seen that's exactly what has happened. And this has some interesting statistics. It took the human species 300,000 years to reach its first billion, only 130 years to add a second billion, 30 years to get to the third billion, and now we're going up in billions every, 15 to 10 years. And so that's really rapid growth. And so, yeah, you can see that we didn't get to 1 billion until around 1700. And we get to our second billion until around 1900, but we've been adding billions multiple times in the last century. So I think these are really big numbers and they're really hard to wrap your head around. So I like to think about it in the context of your life. It's not letting me use my cursor. Here we go. So this calculator, and you guys can click on it when you're ready, you can look up how many people were on the planet when you were born. So, see, it's 2020. Let's assume some of you are about 20 years old. Some of you are going to be a little older. Some of you are a little younger. Some of you might be a lot older or younger, but I'll just go ahead and put in, January 1st, 2000. So there were about 6 billion people on the planet if you're about to turn 21, basically. And today we're at 7.8 billion. So we've added 1.8 billion people in the last roughly 21 years. I'll put mine in. So I am 38 years old. No, I was not born in 2020. 1982. And you can see there are only 4.5 billion people when I was born. And so we haven't doubled yet, but we're not terribly far from doubling in just my lifetime. And that's pretty crazy in my opinion. What we can see is that in a lot of the more developed countries, so like the United States, Europe, Japan, places like that, the population growth has really slowed. Where we're seeing higher population growth is in less developed regions of the world. And so they're contributing a lot to population growth. And we can see this shows the population density. So those people are obviously not evenly distributed throughout the world. And we can see places like the northeast of the United States, some parts of Europe, and some parts of India and Bangladesh, and a few very large cities in China are showing up as really dense population centers. Also, Indonesia has some places with very high population densities. This looks at the total number of people and it looks at the population growth rate. So they actually estimate that we're starting to slow down but they're expecting us to plateau somewhere around 11 billion people. That's a lot more people than we have today. And the reason we're talking about this is because we need to understand what this means for our resources that are available and how well our ecosystems will keep being able to provide services to people when we get to these numbers. So we looked at where people are the most dense. This shows projected percent population change by 2050. And you can see a lot of the countries, which are the darkest blue, that are expected to grow the most are in Africa and the Middle East. But the gray countries are the ones that are expected to increase 26 to 99%. So they're the ones that are going to grow the second most. Which includes a lot of places, including the United States, Mexico, and most of South America. So a lot of places are going to be growing quite a bit. The really light blue are the ones that are expected to grow less than 1%. And this includes a lot of Eastern and Central Europe and Russia and a few other countries spread in there as well. We can learn a lot about the growth rate of different populations, including wildlife populations, plant populations, and human populations by looking at their age structure. If there are a lot of children in the country, a lot more children than adults and a lot more children than older people, we can infer that the population is rapidly growing. So you can see here, this is the country of Niger. Most of the population is between 0 and 20 years old. That is the largest proportion of the population. And as you get into the child rearing years, there are less, and there are more of them than there are the oldest people. This population is growing really quickly. If all the different age classes have about the same number of people, we can infer that that's a stable population. And so an example of this is Sweden, where we see that there are similar proportions in each age group all the way up. A declining population, you can see, will have more adults than children. And this is a population that will decrease through time. We can tell this because the younger age classes are eventually going to be in the reproductive category, which is this middle band. And if there are fewer of them than there are current reproductive, that means that they're declining in population size. So this is how they figure out and project populations of different places into the country as they look at the age structure, and then they can project what's going to happen in the future. Where this becomes a problem is it relates to how many resources each person uses. And so Thomas Malthus is famous for looking at this and looking at resource limitation. And the idea is if we use a certain amount of resources and our population is increasing exponentially, the amount of resources we might be able to increase how many we can get by producing more or by using technology to extract more resources. But at some point, if population is growing exponentially, we're less likely to have exponentially more resources. Resources tend to be more finite. So there is this point of crisis where we might end up with more people than any given resource. Now, there's probably a different point of crisis for lots of different kinds of resources. So it might be different for water than it is for food production or the amount of fish in the ocean that we want to eat. All of these kind of things probably have different points of crisis because there's different supplies of these different resources. All right, so I will pause here.